Hey people, Eric Leader here, and thanks for joining me today. And hey, I'm over here at Cypress View Studios doing some sessions this week and working on this video too. And I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, click the like button, share it with someone you know, follow me on Facebook, or subscribe to my channel on YouTube. Hey, let's make it happen. The collection on Palmetto, it's a museum of cars. Brass era cars. But you know, also during that brass era was the flywheelers. That's what I saw last week, was a bunch of flywheelers. They have some here too. So this was a great little stop at a museum in Clearwater, Florida. You get a chance, come on over to the collection on Palmetto. You'll be sorry if you don't. I thought I was done going back in time, but I'm headed back to the flywheeler because it's the same era as this museum. International Harvester is a big deal to me. I love International Harvester equipment, and this truck right here is pretty cool. International Harvester fire truck. Here's a fire tractor, and it's complete with its own roller. And more International Harvester tractors here. You know I'm going to be filming those things if they're around. John Deere's mixed in, of course. But the star of the show down there in Fort Meade was the flywheeler machine, and all of them that were there. And this museum that I went to had flywheelers as well. One of the gentlemen working there at the collection on Palmetto told me that they normally go to the flywheeler down there in Fort Meade and check out what's going on down there because their museum is in the same era as flywheelers. Flywheelers happened at the turn of the 19th century and to the 20th century, and so did the brass era cars that they have. And he said they didn't go this year, and I showed him a couple of videos of some things that I saw down there, and he seemed to enjoy it. And he ran their flywheelers for me. They had both compressed air running flywheelers, and they had some that were running on natural gas. It was pretty cool to see all of that in action, and they just had a permanent setup there of flywheelers, a whole bunch of them. I want to tell you a little bit about this brass era I keep talking about and what we're actually referring to when we say brass era is an early period of automotive manufacturing, kind of the end of the 19th century through the First World War, 1895 roughly through 1915. And it was named for the brass fittings that were used on the cars. They put brass horns, lights, radiators, ornamentation of all kind on there, and they did that in lieu of using gold and silver. Gold and silver would tarnish more quickly and easily than brass and probably cost a lot more money too, if I'm to be honest. These cars were known as horseless carriages because they were building cars right after using these carriages, and it's like, hey, what other design do we use? We're going to use this carriage design and stick a motor on it. Horseless carriage, that's where that name came from. These cars were driven by a chain and sprocket and typically had a tiller that you used to steer with, and they were hand cranked, and the engine would be, you'd have a crank on the front of the car for the engine. No electric starters in this period of time. French car companies may have been the first to use brass on their cars, and they did it to upscale the cars, make them more attractive to people. Not only was the material maybe a little bit better to work with or cheaper or what have you, but they wanted them to look good. And that was a big thing about the brass and having people be attracted to their cars. And rich folks like that shiny stuff because it made them look good, made them look like, man, we're rich. But anyways, the right-hand steering was also a feature of these cars. Left-hand steering, like the United States has, was not standardized at that time. Right hand was pretty much used because buggy drivers a lot of times rode on the right-hand side when they were controlling the horses. So they just automatically stuck that driver of the car right there on the right-hand side until 1908 when Henry Ford standardized left-hand drive. Some of the horseless carriages even had a spot on them, a little, ferrule or something up there where reins could be run through. They still had that left over from carriages that were pulled by horses where they could still run reins through them. And by the way, that came in handy when the car broke down and you needed a horse to pull it out of the ditch or to pull it down the road because the engine stopped running. So they just hooked the horse up to the front of the thing, ran the reins down through those little pieces that hold the reins in the front of the car, and they were in business. You know, nowadays in the United States of America, there are only about 4 major manufacturers of cars. But back in the brass era, there were somewhere around 1,000 car makers out there. And, you know, they kind of got whittled down as time went on. The Depression, I'm sure, knocked a bunch of them out, and competition and such. But think about that, 1,000 different car makers back then versus you can only buy you a Tesla, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, as far as American cars nowadays. The 1886 Benz motor wagon is considered the first modern car. And this example at the museum is a replica built in 1986. And according to the museum, it is one of about 90 or so that were built. What's cool about this car is that Ben's wife, Bertha, drove this car on a long trip to see family, and that's what really validated the car as something that the general masses could rely on for transportation and get rid of that horse. That's got to be pretty exciting for those folks back then. It's a curved dash Oldsmobile from 1901, and this is where the dashboard was named, and it was a leather or wood piece that deflected the debris that was kicked up or splashed or dashed up from the horse's hooves, and it was continued on in cars to make them more familiar to people because they were used to seeing that on their carriages. Eat your heart out, Elon. This 1904 Pulp Waverly was just another in a long line of electric cars dating back to the 1830s. Brass era 1904 Cadillac that fully represents the brass they put on cars of the era. The hand crank shown on this 1907 Northern was the way they started car engines until the electric start was invented in 1912. I am sure that people were happy to see that electric start coming because there are no more broken arms and broken shoulders and everything else that happened when people were cranking a car like that. Stanley Steamer, they can clean your carpets, or you can drive around in one of them. How about that? What's under the hood? Well, a Stanley Steamer engine, of course. Battery chargers from across the time, and I figured out that my own battery charger is like this one right here. Got to be from the 90s. Yep, it is. I've had it for a while. This Stanley is a model like the first car used by the United States president. Seems as though Congress ordered a couple of these cars to haul the big man around. Ooh, this is a pretty blue 1913 Stanley Steamer. A Pierce Arrow from 1913 in a beautiful blue. Yeah, my favorite color, as you know. Even the wheels are in blue. Love it. The leather interior of this Pierce Arrow is beautiful. And the gentleman at the front door of the museum that took our money said that in addition to doing admissions, he is responsible for detailing all the cars. Said that he had to keep the original leathers on these cars conditioned to prevent them from drying out in the air conditioning of the museum. Yep, some of these cars still have their original leather interior. When you think Fiat, you think Italian built. No, this 1914 Fiat was built in New York. One of the 3 P's in American luxury, a 1915 Peerless. Hey people, I know some of you out there are like, 3 P's, what are you talking about? Well, the 3 P's are Peerless, Pierce Arrow, and Packard. Simply the best in P's of American luxury. You know, if I lived back in these days, I would need this 1915 Stanley Mountain Wagon to haul all of my instruments and guitars and stuff around. Hey, this is the SUV of the day, I do believe. While I am partial to blue on cars, I really do like this two-tone green 1925 Stanley. The museum also has a few modern cars, more along the lines of today, including this Lamborghini, a 1969 and a 1954 Jag, or as the Brits might say, Jaguar. Hey, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you. God bless you. Peace.